Hi, my name is Liron, and I'm a migration specialist in the Google Apps support team. And today we're going to show how to synchronize your LDAP server or Active Directory with Google Apps using Google Apps Directory Sync. In order to do that, I've prepared a configuration file for Google Apps Directory Sync with all the settings that we're going to review now. So first, you need to go to All Programs, Google Apps Directory Sync, and start the Configuration Manager. If you have an existing configuration file, like I do, you're going to have to open that configuration file, such as this configuration file here. So first we see the general settings. Here we choose what we want to sync. So in my case, I want to sync my organization and unit structure, my user accounts, and my groups. I don't care so much about user profiles, shared contacts, and calendar resources, but I'll explain quickly what each of them does. So user profiles is additional information about my users, such as their phone numbers, their addresses, etc. Shared contacts is domain shared contacts, which is usually saved as contacts in Active Directory, for example, which is external users, not users in my own domain. And it could be their email addresses and again all kinds of information. And calendar resources allows you to synchronize resources such as rooms, shared equipment, or anything like that from your existing directory to Google Apps. It's important to note that when synchronizing resources using Google Apps Directory Sync, it only synchronizes the resource itself and not the contents of its calendar. But again, we're not going to cover any of these. We're only going to do the basics, which are organization units, users of course, and groups. So let's start. First, we have to do our Google Apps configuration. I've entered my test domain's name here. I choose to replace the domain names in LDAP email addresses. And what this does is, because my Active Directory domain is not called demo.zevel.org, the email addresses there don't end with @ this domain. So I want GADS to automatically replace the domain part of my email addresses with this. So if you have an internal email address structure and you want to migrate it to Google Apps, you can use this option. Now I can choose how to authorize GADS with my domain. I can either use OAuth or administrator credentials. OAuth is recommended and is usually better, but for this demonstration purposes, I'm going to use my admin credentials. You can use either one, they're both supported and safe. Let's click Test Connection to make sure that my credentials are correct and my network is working, and I see that the connection has indeed succeeded. So this is good. Now for the LDAP configuration. I'm using Active Directory. I want to connect using standard LDAP connection. I don't want to connect using LDAP over SSL. The host name, if you're using Active Directory, it's best to put your domain name as the host name, otherwise enter the host name or IP address of your LDAP server. And again, because I'm using Active Directory, I'm putting my domain name here. So this is an internal domain, of course, internal test domain. The port is the standard LDAP port 389. If you're using LDAP over SSL, it might be 636. For authentication, I'm using simple authentication. I've entered my admin account credentials here, and for my base DN, I've entered the path to my mail users organization unit on my Active Directory. You see that this part correlates to this part here. And again, I'm going to test the connection quickly, and I see that it connected to the LDAP server. This means that the network connection is okay and my base DN is okay. If I had a wrong base DN, for example, let's just enter a random letter here, I can see that the connection fails and it says that name not found exception, and there is no such base DN. But we're not going to do that. We're going to be using the correct base DN, and it works again. So org units. Synchronizing org units is optional, but it might be useful for a lot of people, so I'm showing it here. You can choose to ignore it if in general settings you untick the organization unit checkbox. But if you ticked it, you have two options then. You can tell GADS to create your organization unit structure, or you can tell GADS to not create or delete organization units on Google, but just use the existing ones and move users to the correct organization units based on your LDAP server structure. Let's look at the structure issue first. We want to map our organizational unit structure on our LDAP to Google Apps. So what we can do is simply map DNs of organizational units on our LDAP server to an organization on Google Apps. So here I did the simplest thing. I mapped my base DN to the /, which is the root organization on Google Apps. It's important to note that if you want to map other organizations, you don't have to start with the /. You can just write the name of the organization. If you want to map to the root, you have to enter / only. And because I do want GADS to create my organizational structure, I did not tick this box. And now I have to create a search rule. This search rule will allow GADS to identify the organizational units in my LDAP server. So I've already created one here, and you can see that the attribute that includes the name of the organizational units in my LDAP is called name, and the rule to find organizational units is object class equals organizational unit. Base DN is optional. I'm leaving it blank because I want to use the default base DN that I entered. Now let's talk about the most important thing, user accounts. The email address attribute is the name of the attribute that contains the email address. This is the heart of the user on Google Apps, because on Google Apps every user must have an email address and is identified by that email address primarily. Mail is the correct attribute name for Active Directory. It might be something else on your LDAP server. Alias address attributes. I did not enter any here because my users do not have any aliases or nicknames or alternate addresses. If you don't enter any attributes here, GADS will simply ignore it and will not synchronize aliases, and will also not remove existing nicknames on Google Apps. So if you're not sure, you can just leave it blank. The deletion suspension policy. The default is to delete only active Google Apps users that are not found in the LDAP, and suspended users are retained. If you have a suspended user on Google Apps, GADS will not touch it. And if you remove the user from the LDAP, or there's a user that's simply not found on the LDAP but is active on Google Apps, GADS will try to delete it. So this might be a bit unsafe, and that depends on your configuration, but I would recommend choosing to suspend Google Apps users that are not found in the LDAP instead of deleting them. That means that if a user is deleted on the LDAP or simply missing from the LDAP, GADS will try to suspend the user in Google Apps. If that was done by mistake, you can easily unsuspend the user in Google Apps and restore it. And importantly, don't remove this tick box. This tick box prevents GADS from suspending or deleting Google Apps admins. You never want GADS to remove your admins from Google Apps. If you have an admin that's left the organization, you should do it manually from Google Apps as opposed to doing it automatically, because this just adds a lot of risk and complexity. Let's talk about the user attributes. So the basic attributes are first name, last name, and password, of course, in addition to the email address. So for the first name is given name, and the last name is SN in Active Directory. The mailbox quota size can be ignored. It's always 25 gig on Google Apps. I don't really want to synchronize passwords, but you have to have a password for a new user that's created on Google Apps, so I'm just leaving it default and empty, so GADS will generate a random password of 8 characters and assign that password to the user. My users can then go in and change their passwords, or I can change it for them on the control panel. This is because GADS does not support synchronizing passwords from Active Directory, because the passwords are on Active Directory are not encoded in one of the supported ways. GADS support password encoded as SHA-1, MD5, which is hashed. The password is hashed in either SHA-1 or MD5 hashes, or plain password that is not encoded, not encrypted or hashed, but encoded in base 64, or just a plain text password. If you want to use password sync, you need to choose the way in which the password is saved in your LDAP server. You enter the name of the attribute that includes the passwords, and optionally, and this is very much recommended, you can tell GADS to only sync changed passwords, and then enter the attribute that includes the time when the password changed, or any other attribute that changes every time the password changes. Because GADS cannot save the password itself for security reasons, it will save this attribute instead, and will only sync passwords once this attribute is changed. But because we're not going to sync password at all, we just leave it in the default. Now we're going to use a search rule for finding users. Let's see what we have here. Now first, because we are syncing organizational units, we have to tell GADS where we want to put our users. So I've already created a mapping, so I can just tell it to put it on an org unit based on the mapping. This part will not appear if you're not synchronizing orgs. You can tell GADS to suspend certain users on Google Apps, so sync them and create them suspended, or suspend them if they moved to this to be returned by this search rule. But we're not going to use that. That's a more advanced scenario. The basic search rule for Active Directory is this. So object category equals person, object class equals user, and mail equals star, meaning that I only want users, not contacts or anything else, that have email addresses. This part is optional, the mail equals star. If you don't do it, GADS will get users that don't have email addresses, but they will simply be ignored. However, because they are ignored, there is no point in retrieving them at all. It will only add more error messages to our logs, and we don't want that. And of course, the base DN, again, optional, and we don't need to enter it because we have the same base DN. And now group sync. This is, again, optional. You don't have to synchronize groups. You can ignore that completely if you want. But a lot of users want to synchronize their groups because it's very handy. So I created a simple group sync rule here. Again, object category equals group, and you can see mail equals star because all groups must have email addresses in Google Apps. So we can only sync groups that have email addresses. The email address is mail. The group display name attribute is name in an Active Directory. Again, it could be different on your LDAP server. And the description attribute is description. These are all descriptive attributes. Now about the group contents, member reference attribute is member. Again, in Active Directory, and it could be different on your LDAP server. And the owner reference attribute is managed by. Reference attributes versus literal attributes. What this means is that in your LDAP server, groups could be represented as either a list of references to other objects. For example, in Active Directory, that's the way it works. I have a list of DNs, distinguished names, which are essentially pointers to users and contacts in my LDAP directory. Or I could have a literal list, which is just a list of email addresses. So because in Active Directory it works like this, I entered the name of the attribute here. If in my LDAP server I have an attribute that just has a list of members' email addresses, I would enter that attribute name here. Same thing goes for owners. Because in Active Directory it's saved as a reference to the owner, I use this field. But if it was the actual owner email address, I would put it here. Now again, we're not going to cover user profiles, shared contacts, and calendar resources. I'm just going to skip then to notifications. This is mandatory. Even if you are not really interested in it, you have to fit it in. So the simplest way to fit it in is your Google Apps admin address here, your Google Apps admin address here again, and then here aspmx.l.google.com. You cannot use smtp.google.com because GADS does not support encrypted SMTP connections, which are required by smtp.google.com. But aspmx.l.google.com accepts unencrypted SMTP connections. You can only use it to send to addresses on Google Apps. If you have addresses that are not in Google Apps, you can enter the name of that external SMTP server here. You can also send a test notification to see if the connection succeeds, and we see that it is successful. So this is good. Quick words about the sync limits. If you remember, we had GADS option to delete or suspend users. We can tell GADS that if it is trying to delete more than 5% of the users or organizations or groups, it should not run the sync. And this is a safety feature. So I'm going to leave it at the default because I don't intend to delete any users in this demonstration. But if you want to avoid accidents with deleting users, you can use this feature and you can lower it to 1%, or if you're going to regularly delete a lot of users, you can raise this limit. You can also use number instead of percentage here. About logging, the default file name is sync.log in the Google Apps directory sync folder, in the installation folder, and the log level is info. Usually you would leave it at this. If you have any kind of issues and you want to see what is happening, you can change the log level to trace, and then you will get a full account of what GADS is doing during the sync, what it's reading from the LDAP, what it's reading from Google Apps, and why it's doing what it's doing. If you do that, it's helpful to change the name of the log file name, so you'll have log file with just this sync as opposed to all your historical syncs. And don't forget to switch the log level back to info when you're done, otherwise you'll get very large logs. And now finally we can do the sync. So first we see that we filled everything correctly because everything here has this nice check mark and we didn't forget anything. We have an option to clear the cache, which is useful if you did any changes on Google Apps since your last synchronization with GADS, so I'm just going to do it just to be safe. If you have any kind of issues where GADS is doing weird things with the sync, it's preferable to clear the cache. First, I'm going to run a simulation to make sure I set up everything correctly. So it's initializing, reading from the LDAP, reading from Google, and doing an analysis to compare. So here we see that from organizations, we have 3 local or LDAP organizations and none remotely because this is my first sync. So it's saying that it will create 2 new organizations called managers and users, which is identical to what I have in my LDAP server. And this is good. So analyze users, 2 local, 1 remote. This remote user is an admin, so it's not suggesting to delete it because it's protected. So I have 2 users, Joe Mailbox and Kate Recipient. My user number 1, Joe M. It will be created in the org called users. Name is Joe Mailbox, and it will have a password like a random password. But it will be encoded as SHA-1 in transport to Google. And again, with Kate Recipient, she's a manager, so she will be in the org called managers. And the same thing with her given name, family name, and password. We have 1 group called test users, and you can see that I have a description here and a display name. I have 2 members, Kate and Joe, and the owner is Kate. I like what I'm seeing, and you can click to view the full logs in the default viewer, but I'm not going to do that because the summary looks good. It's important to always review the summary. If it's your first sync, of course, it's not that important because you can always delete everything and run the sync again, but it's very, very much recommended to review the summary anyway. It's shorter than deleting everything and starting again. And of course, if this is already a production domain and you've made any configuration changes, make sure you review the summary thoroughly before continuing. And now you have 2 options with regards to sync. If you're only doing a one-time sync, essentially to migrate users, you can just run the sync from the configuration manager here, which is what I'm going to do. Yes, I know I'm going to make changes to Google Apps. Please don't click this if you haven't run the simulation yet. Okay, so let's see. I see that this is the summary here. I don't have any failures with organizations. I don't have any failures with users, and I don't have any failures with groups. So this looks good. Okay, now we can look at my Google Apps control panel and refresh it quickly. And I see that I have my test users group here. And here under organization and users, I see I have my admin account. Under that I have managers, where I have Kate, and users, where I have Joe. Now, if you want to regularly synchronize your LDAP with Google Apps, so you will be managing your users on your LDAP, but you want them to be created in Google Apps automatically, or changed, removed, etc., you can schedule a sync. So with Windows, you would do that using the task scheduler. I'm going to go to the task scheduler now and schedule a sync to happen, for example, every day. There is no recommendation as to how often you should sync. You could sync every day, you could sync every hour, theoretically. You won't necessarily want to do that, but you could. And you could sync manually when you have new people joining or leaving, or you could sync once every month if you like. Again, depending on your needs. So let's create a new scheduled task. Let's call it Google Apps Directory Sync. I'm going to run the Google Apps Directory Sync executable, which is sync cmd, but I have to add some command line arguments, which is -a to apply the changes to the sync and not just run a simulation, and -c and give the path to the configuration file, which would be similar to this. Now I need to put in my administrator account that will run this task. And again, this is different between different versions of Windows. And now I have a scheduled task, and I didn't schedule it to any specific time. You can do this on the Schedule tab. Let's say daily at 9 a.m. And now we can run it manually. We have to make sure that the configuration manager is closed while the task is running. Now, because I already did the changes, there will be no additional changes during this run. But if I did create another user now, you would see that these changes are being synced to Google Apps. And of course, if you want to run it manually, you can also do it using the command line. If I navigate to the Google Apps Directory Sync folder, I can run the sync command, sync-cmd -a -c, and then the path to my documents, which would be and then this again will run the sync. You can also clear the cache using the command line just by adding the -f option. This option will clear the cache and then run the sync, for example. You'll notice that it takes a bit longer because GADS now has to contact the Google Apps to do read of the configuration there. And that's it. You've now set up Google Apps with Google Apps Directory Sync.